Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Vancouver if you happen to be here. Um, yeah, it's really nice out. Spring is here, although as you probably noticed, we changed our clocks here in Canada. I don't know if, I guess actually all three of you online are in Canada, so I guess you probably know that already. Um, but of course, it means one less hour of sleep, so I think people are probably struggled to get out of bed. Right, Amanpreet? You don't think they did, or you didn't? You didn't? Just hopped out? I did not hop out. So Ryan is here. Good morning, Ryan. Shania is here. Good morning, Shania. And Simrat is here. Good morning, Simrat. Okay, so where were we on? Right, so on Thursday, I guess it was, on Thursday, we were talking about the social construction of race in Canada, right? And how, we we often think of Canada as a multicultural country and a very sort of accepting and tolerant country in terms of people's race and ethnicity and religion and culture and to some degree all of those things are true, but to another degree they're also sometimes not true, and particularly for Indigenous people in Canada, the experience of Canada has been quite a bit different from the way that Canada is kind of advertised and the way Canada is kind of thought of in other countries. We kind of walked through a bit of Indigenous history in Canada, and we started almost all the way at the beginning when Indigenous people first came to North and South America, right, around 14,000 years ago. And we said that really up until 1492, when Columbus arrives, Indigenous people are, living in this part of the world by themselves, right, and existing in kind of existing sort of by themselves in an uninterrupted fashion. But of course, once Europeans start to arrive, first with traders and explorers, and later with missionaries and colonists, slowly more and more people start coming to this part of the world. And Indigenous people quickly learn that these Europeans aren't kind of there, on vacation, that they mean to stay in the country. They mean to set up towns, and they're creating farms and railways, and more immigrants are coming to, good morning, more and more immigrants are coming to Canada and settling. Indigenous people know that their way of life is changing, and they're going to have to change too. They're going to have to adapt. They're going to have to come to some sort of agreement or relationship with these new Europeans. And so we said that by the time we get to 1871, so this is about 4 years after Canada becomes a country, things for Indigenous people aren't really looking that great, right? Their numbers have been significantly decreased by disease, right? The buffalo have been hunted out in central Canada, causing basically famine and starvation for Indigenous people. And of course, the government of Canada itself is kind of flexing its muscles, right? So the government of Canada has political power. They also have kind of military power, if you will, because Canada doesn't have a military at that point, but we do have the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Have you ever seen the RCMP around here, Mulder or Amanpreet? No? You don't see them good morning. You don't see them in Metro Vancouver, because here we have Vancouver Police Department. But if you go to North Van or other places, you'll see some places don't have a police force, and so the federal police, the RCMP, will be the police. And if you've ever seen them, sometimes traditionally they wear those, they've got like black pants and red jackets and those hats that are kind of flat. Have you ever seen? No? Even like in touristy places? No? Anyway, the government had RCMP as well to kind of enforce the law. And so again, Indigenous people realized that they were going to have to enter into treaty. They knew they were going to have to create a relationship with the government, and so they did. Depending on where you were in the country, Indigenous people were kind of more or less desperate to sign an agreement with the government, and so in some places they negotiated hard for a good treaty. In some cases they were forced to kind of sign whatever the government put in front of them. In some cases, like here in BC, treaties weren't really signed at all. And treaties, here in BC, the Indigenous people have a slightly different relationship with the government because, again, no treaties were ever signed. Good morning. And so sometimes you'll hear people talk about the idea that here in Vancouver and here in BC, we are on the unceded territory of Indigenous people. And it means to cede is to give up, right? To pass to someone else. And often there are statements of recognition saying that Indigenous people actually did not sign over this land. In some cases, in central Canada, they signed treaties that did say that. And again, whether those things are kind of legitimate and legally binding is another question. But here in BC, that never happened. And so, think of someone who moved into your house. They don't really pay any rent. They didn't buy the house, but they're still there. And they're not leaving. And so, you have people that are living here that are, never really obtained any permission or purchased anything, or they just showed up and stayed. And so sometimes in BC we note that fact that Europeans came here and they settled and they built cities and all kinds of things, but there was no real agreement with Indigenous people. They didn't really buy the land or lease it or come to some sort of agreement to be here. They just kind of showed up and stayed, right? Most of the treaties you see signed across Canada have something to do with an exchange of rights to be on the land for cash payments, rights to hunt and fish, reserve lands, various other things, education, various other things. And again, the agreement was made with Indigenous people kind of, I wonder if I have a slide here. Yeah. The treaties were made so that Indigenous people could do these things, right? So that they could secure their survival, so they could transition to a new way of living, and so that they could establish a relationship with the federal government and sort of continue to kind of work through the relationship, right? To continue to negotiate. But we said that, like the belt. But we said the government wanted something different, right? They wanted to actually buy the land. And we said Indigenous people never really had a concept for that. They never really thought of land as anything that could be bought or sold. And so Indigenous people thought, okay, we'll sign these deals. These Europeans are going to be here and we'll allow them to, and we'll continue to work it out, right? We'll continue to work on the relationship and negotiate and figure things out, right? But again, the Canadian government thought, we're going to go in, we're going to negotiate, we're going to buy this land, and then we're going to go about trying to assimilate these people into Canada itself, which, again, is exactly what they tried to do. And so the end result of this, regardless of what Indigenous people thought they were doing, they did wind up giving up their land to the Canadian government and kind of settling for small reserve lands that were kind of way out of the way, often not in the best kind of territory. Lots of things that the Indigenous people negotiated did not show up in the final treaty, so they never got them. And some things that they asked for, they got, they got, but not, they didn't really get what they asked for. And that, of course, has to do with education, which we'll get to in a minute. We said that shortly after these treaties are signed, the Indian Act is passed, and actually I was going to show you this on Thursday. The Indian Act is still a real thing. Let me just see here. Here it is. Yeah, so here it is. You can actually find it on the Government of Canada website. And so you can go through it and you can read, let me just put it in the middle here. Yeah, you can read the whole thing here. Everything, this is the Indian Act, and there are a lot of things, there's a lot of stuff going on in this legal document. It goes on for quite some time. There's a lot of things in this legal document, and really none of them apply to someone like me. Good morning. None of this applies to someone like me. It only applies to Indigenous people in Canada. And so you can see, if I back up here, you can see sort of the table of contents. And initially when this thing was passed, there was a lot more kind of racist and clear attempts to get Indigenous people to assimilate into Canada. Some of that stuff has since been taken out, and so it's not quite as sort of racist or assimilatory as it used to be. But again, it's still a piece of legislation that applies only to one group in Canada based on their race or ethnicity, right? There's nothing in here that has anything to do with me. Let's go back here. So yeah, they passed this Indian Act again in an attempt to make Indigenous people go away, right? Because to the Canadian government, they were inconvenient, right? They were in the way of progress. They were in the way of creating a country that was white and Christian and based on farming, and inconveniently there's the Indigenous people kind of floating around still with no place to go, of course, because they had been pushed aside, right? And their buffalo had been killed, and so they kind of had nowhere to fit, and certainly they didn't fit into sort of white European civilization, and the white Europeans didn't really want to let them fit in anyway. And you can see here that Duncan Campbell Scott, the head of Indian Affairs in 1893, is trying to make the Indian problem go away, right? He's just trying to, how do we kind of get rid of these people? How do we get them out of our hair so we can continue with our country as we see it, right? And so this is kind of what the Indian Act is. It's an attempt to control and remove power from Indigenous people and assimilate them to the point where eventually there are no Indians, quote unquote, left. Somebody in the quiz on Friday, somebody actually asked the question, and I usually mention this, but I didn't. Why are they being called Indians? Yeah, because Christopher Columbus at first thought he was in India, because that's where he was trying to go, landed in North or South America, said, oh look, this is India, here's Indians. But of course, they're not Indians, they're not from India, but the name stuck anyway. And so, for the most part, I would, in terms of talking about Indigenous people, I use the word Indigenous because Indigenous means coming from a certain place, which they kind of do. I'll use First Nations a lot because that's pretty accurate. You'll hear people use Aboriginal as well. Some people like that term and some people don't, because if you're abnormal, what does that mean? It means you're not normal, right? So if you're aboriginal, it's like you're not original. But of course, you are. These are the original people, right? So it's kind of a weird term. Some people use it, some people don't like it. It depends on who it is. Indian is something that we don't really use anymore. The problem is that it refers to a legal document. So, like, I wouldn't use it in regular speech. I wouldn't refer to Indigenous people in Canada as Indians, and I don't think anyone would anymore. But unfortunately, because it's in that law, it's still a word that we have to use in a legal sense. Right. But I forgot to mention that last week. Yeah. So the Indian Act went about trying to assimilate people, went about banning their spiritual activities, encouraging them to abandon their status. If they wanted citizenship and voting rights, they would have to abandon their Indian status. And of course, in abandoning it, they would cease to get any benefit from the government. There were regulations about who could and couldn't be seen as Indigenous. There were parts of it that said women who married non-Indigenous men would lose their Indian status, and so would their children. And so everything was kind of carefully designed. Good morning. Everything was kind of carefully designed to make these people go away, to disappear them somehow, right? And probably no more so than Indian residential schools. Again, this was in the treaties, right? Because Indigenous families knew that their kids would require an education, and an education that they couldn't give them. And so they sent them to schools hoping that they would get that. And again, that's really what all parents do, right? They send their kids to school hoping their kids will get a good education. And the Indigenous families did the same. Very sadly, of course, they didn't get that. Any education that they actually got was pretty substandard. It would have allowed them to just work the lowest level of job in society, so they could sort of just read and write barely, kind of thing. But worse than that, worse than getting the bad education was, again, these schools were tools of assimilation. So these children were taken far, far away from their homes, hundreds of kilometers away. They stayed at these schools for months and months and months, and they were brutalized, right? Especially if they did anything cultural, spoke their own language, told a traditional story, performed a ritual, anything like that, sang a song, anything that was a part of their original culture, they would be brutally, brutally punished, right? And I said that about 30% of First Nations kids were put into this school system, and they were in operation until, I think the last one closed in 1993, shockingly. So they start up here, you can see in 1876, and they're in operation all the way until 25 or 30 years ago. By the time the last one closes, most of them have closed. Like, it's just, it's the last one sort of thing. But still, for decades, kids are going to these schools and being brutalized. And you can't, the problem is you don't get over this sort of treatment immediately, right? These kinds of things have generational impacts, right? People don't come out of a school that treats them like this and then everything's fine, right? You don't have, that trauma doesn't really heal, especially when there's no resources to heal it. And then again, it gets passed through generations, right? So yeah, if you're a kid who goes to a school like this, how do you deal with this treatment after you get out, right? And then, in your own families, do you repeat this kind of treatment? And so, again, the effects of these things kind of echoed through the generations. And sometimes there's multiple generations of Indigenous people that went to Indian residential schools. And again, you can't do this to a population of people and expect, that they will just, oh, well, they'll get over it. Or when they get out of school, it's fine, it's over. Right? This is absolutely brutal treatment. And again, these kids kind of came out of these schools eventually, if they survived, um, traumatized, abused, really with no skills to speak of, right? Because they were getting a shitty education anyway. And when they came out, of course, there was really no place for them in society, right? Because they didn't fit in at home anymore, right? They didn't fit at home with their indigenous culture. But of course, Canadian or Western culture wouldn't accept them for who they were anyway. So there was really nowhere for them to go. There was no place that was kind of home for them. And so again, this leads to a lot of the problems that we associate with Indigenous communities today. Things like drug and alcohol abuse, high rates of suicide, high rates of mental illness, lots of family problems, abuse of children or children being neglected because parents are, using substances and things like that. Those things come from this history. And again, you can't expect, good morning, you can't expect that, you can't do this to generations of kids and then not expect anything bad to happen, right? And so bad things have happened and continue to happen, because these effects are, again, generational, so they get passed down, and they're hard to stop, right? Like, if you grow up brutalized and abused in an Indian residential school, what are the chances that you're going to create a perfect home life for your family? Probably low, right? It's going to be very difficult for you to get over that treatment, to heal yourself, and then to be able to provide, a stable, loving, safe home for your family, right? But then if your family doesn't grow up, if you don't grow up in that kind of home, what kind of home are you going to create when you're old enough, right? And so these things kind of continue on, and it doesn't, some people are able to heal, some people are able to kind of try to move on from this, but it takes a long time, right? It's not a few years, it's not one generation, it's multiple generations. And so, yeah, some people have argued that what's happened here in Canada amounts to, at the very least, a cultural genocide, or maybe a full-on genocide, right? And that's what we were talking about on Thursday, right? We talked about the idea that this is what a genocide is. So following the Holocaust and World War II, the UN has a convention on genocide and defines what one is and how we should sort of view these types of crimes. And they say that genocide includes all of these things, right? Whether you systematically kill people, or whether you prevent them from giving birth, or whether you transfer their children to another group, or whether you create some sort of situation by which that group will not ultimately survive. All of those things are a genocide, right? And so we read this article on ongoing legacies of genocide and asking that question, right? Saying, is what happened in Canada a genocide? And so I think I asked you some questions, and I'd like to, what should I do here? Yeah. I'd like you to take 3 or 4 minutes just to look over that article one more time, just to remind yourself, because it's been a few days since we looked at it. And if you'll remember, I wanted you to find the argument in this article. I wanted you to answer the question of, why do you think some people might not want to call what's happened in Canada a genocide? And then what are the consequences if we believe this argument, and what are the consequences if we don't believe it, okay? So let me just put 4 minutes on the clock here, and then we'll look over this article again, and then we'll just talk about it, okay? Okay, hopefully that's enough time. Um, let's hear it. So what's the argument in this article? What is Pamela Palmater, I think her name is? What is she trying to convince us of? Yeah, pretty basically, yeah, that what's happened to Indigenous people here in Canada should be understood as a genocide, right? This is not anything less than that. Um, as good critical thinkers, of course, we should ask ourselves, well, why? Why should we believe you, Pamela, that we've had a genocide here in Canada? So, what are some of her premises? Say again? Uh, sorry, the category. Okay, so she's saying that if you look at how the UN defines genocide, the UN says you have a genocide if your country does any of these things, right? One, two, three, four. And she goes through and says that Canada, in fact, has done all of those things to Indigenous people at one time or another in their history, right? All of those boxes are checked, right? So you have criteria for what a genocide is, and Canada has done those things. Tick, 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 right? That's probably a big part of her evidence here, a big part of her premises is that it fits the definition of what the UN calls genocide. There's probably a little bit more, or a couple, maybe one or maybe two other premises. What do you think? Why else should we believe that this is a genocide? The what? Yeah, the intention was to wipe them out. Yeah, so she says that there's some debate about intention, right? And some people have tried to claim that, in fact, you can only have a genocide if you mean to do it, right? And so if you accidentally wipe out a group of people, it's not a genocide. And some people in Canada here have tried to claim that, oh well, who is it? The Aboriginal Affairs Minister John Duncan, who she quotes as saying, "Oh, what we have here is, an educational policy gone wrong, right? Like, whoops, we accidentally created a school system that brutalized thousands of young Indigenous kids. Whoops, right? No, it's not an accident when that happens, right?" And she supplies a quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, who says, yes, kids die in schools at a much greater rate than they do in their home villages, but that doesn't justify a change of our policy. Really? Kids dying in your school doesn't cause you to change your policy? What does, I wonder? So, yeah, Pamela is saying that whether or not you count intention, and intention doesn't matter, right? It doesn't, just because you don't intend to commit a genocide doesn't mean that you don't. Here, the federal government has obviously tried to make these people disappear in multiple ways, right? They've worked hard to destroy their culture, to separate their children from their families, to adopt out Indigenous kids into white families. You can see there's forced sterilization. All of these things are attempts to make these people go away, right? And so, yeah, intention doesn't matter. And it seems that even if it did matter, the Canadian government has been intentional about this anyway. What else? Is there any other premises? I think there might be one more. There might be one more. I'm kind of thinking the last one might have to do with quote unquote success, right? So do you need to actually exterminate a group of people totally to have a genocide? No, right? And in fact, I would suggest that I don't think any genocide in history has been entirely quote unquote successful in that regard, right? Hitler very successfully engineered a genocide in Nazi Germany, but are there still Jewish people? Yes, there's lots of them, right? He killed a lot of people, but he didn't wipe them out. But most people would say he's very guilty, Nazi Germany is very guilty of genocide. So the fact that Indigenous people are still here doesn't mean that we haven't had a genocide in Canada. What do you think of number 2? Why do you think people might want to reject Pamela's argument? Why do you think they might not want to believe this one? Yeah, it probably does, right? Because again, I don't know what all of your impressions of Canada was like prior to coming here. But, I kind of know, I think I know the reputation that Canada has, right? We have a reputation as a place that's tolerant and accepting and friendly and open and liberal and things like this. And so, not only do we advertise ourselves this way, but we also believe our own advertising, right? This is actually who Canadians kind of think that they are. But of course, Pamela's argument runs kind of entirely counter to that, right? She's saying that the government of Canada is guilty of a brutal genocide that lasts hundreds of years, right? That's kind of hard to square that with our idea of, the friendly, polite, multicultural Canada. Why else might people want to reject this argument, maybe? What else? They don't. How do you mean they don't see it? It's not happening to Indigenous people, or oh, yeah, right. So it has something to do with the invisibility of privilege thing, right? We said that the dominant group often doesn't see kind of what's happening, especially they don't see the experiences of the minoritized group, right? And so that's one of the things that Pamela is saying, and Pamela is an Indigenous person herself. She's saying that, not only is there this ugly history that I'm telling you about, but this thing is still going on, right? Indigenous people are still suffering at a far greater rate than are non-Indigenous Canadians, right? This is an ongoing problem. This has not gone away. This is not ancient history. Our people are still suffering as a result of these things that happened 10, 20, 40, 100 years ago, right? There's still effects of these things. Yeah, so even though these things are happening, for a good chunk of the country, most of the country doesn't see it, right? Most of the country doesn't live in First Nations communities, right? If you have a reserve, reserves are out of town, right? They're out away from the city, and most people have no reason to or no desire to go to a reservation and see what it's like for the most part. And so, yeah, most people can live their lives, blissfully unaware of what life is like for Indigenous people in Canada. And again, that's part of dominant group privilege, right? You don't experience what the minoritized group is experiencing, and you don't really have to pay attention to it either, because it's not really, it's not really strongly connected with your life. Right? So yeah, there's a privilege element to this for sure. What do you think the consequences are of believing this argument? What happens if people actually believe Pamela? Say that one more time.
Would be in the minority.
Who would be in the
Not too much people believe in it, right? So would be in the minority.
I don't think I understand you. Who would be in the minoritized group?
People who believe this.
Oh, I think whether you believe it or not doesn't really change who the minoritized group is. I guess it's a question of how many people believe this, right? I don't know for sure, but it doesn't really change who's in the minoritized group, if that's what you're saying. Yeah, it's true, right? People might look at Canada a little bit differently if they knew this, right? This isn't something that we advertise to the world. Hey, guess what? We have a genocide too. Most people don't. We don't advertise that, and Canada benefits from the fact that it has the reputation that it does, right? I think part of the reason that immigrants want to come here, and maybe even foreign students want to come here, is because of the reputation that Canada has, right? And if that reputation were to change, that might not be good for Canada, right? Our reputation is an important part of our success, right? Specifically for immigration, because Canada does depend on immigration. And so if we want to keep immigrants coming to Canada continually, which we do, we need people to feel like this is a place they want to come to, right? We need to make Canada attractive to people, and this isn't a great story, right? I don't know if it changes the attractiveness of Canada, but it's not great PR for us. You know what I mean? What else? What are other consequences of believing this argument? It may cause between whom?
Like the people who start believing in it and the ones who do not.
Why would people fight over this, whether they believed it or not?
Like they start arguing to make others also believe, and then others who love their country will be like, no, it's not true. It is.
Right, could cause arguments, Mulder? Say that one more time. Oh, okay. Okay, I'm going to press pause on that for a second. Yeah, so people might argue about whether this is true or not, right? They might argue because some people might have a love for their country, right? And so they might not like to hear an argument like this. Does genocide stir up strong emotions? Yeah, it's a heavy word, right? Like, if your country is guilty of a genocide, that's quite a charge, right? There's a lot of emotional weight to that. And so, yeah, some people may feel the weight of that. Some people might feel that it's unpatriotic, right? That's, somehow, but how do you feel about that? Do you think someone could believe this argument but also love their country? Don't see why not? Why do you not see why not?
Isn't it common sense, like, if your mother punish you for something you did wrong, you still love you for that?
Yeah, you can love something and not agree with everything that it does, right? Or everything that's happened, right? You can still love your country even if it has done something horrible, right? And it is possible to do both of those things. But that said, for some people, there's not enough room in their way of thinking to do that, right? So it's black or white, right? You either love your country or you don't, right? And again, believing this argument and acknowledging what's happened to Indigenous people, I don't think that's not the opposite of loving your country, right? And again, facts are what they are, right? Whether or not you want to believe Pamela's argument, the factual part of her paper, those are true, right? And so she's assembled them into an argument saying this is genocide. But even if you say it's not, all of these things still happened, right? And we still have to acknowledge that they did. And again, I don't think that's not about love for your country or not. That's simply about accepting what has happened in the past, right? And again, these things are all factual. This is historical fact, and some of it is not historical, right? Some of these things are happening right now. Maybe one more consequence of believing this argument. Maybe one more. What's that? Oh, the international sanctions. I'm sorry, I forgot about that. You're right. It's possible that countries may put sanctions on us, right, in order to get us to address what's going on with Indigenous peoples. Probably not, but it's possible. But we do use international sanctions to motivate other countries to do what we want them to do, right? Can we fix a problem if we don't acknowledge it? No, right? If you don't know there's a problem, or if you don't admit that there's a problem, you cannot fix the problem, right? And so if we reject this argument, and if we don't want to believe that there's been a genocide, or if we don't want to hear about any of that, do things get any better for Indigenous people? No, they don't, right? Because you can't fix what you can't acknowledge. And so I would say that's maybe even the biggest consequence of this argument, is that rejecting it means we're not going to look at this, right? We're not going to fix this problem. We're just going to pretend it doesn't exist, like we have for 153 years or whatever it's been, 154 in July. Right? We're just going to continue. We're going to continue to pretend that this doesn't exist, or that it's, their problem, or it's just how they are, and we're just going to leave it, right? Okay, I think it's time for a little break. So take one, come back, and we'll talk about reconciliation, because I think we've had enough negative information. Maybe we can get some positive stuff. So back in 10 for reconciliation. All right, welcome back, people. Oh, we got a counter in here for no reason. So, we said, I think this was Pamela's argument, as near as I can tell. Again, we should understand this, the treatment of Indigenous people by the Canadian government as a cultural genocide, or maybe just a full-on genocide. Again, like Mulder mentioned, Article 2 defines genocide as doing certain things, and Pamela says the Canadian government has done those things, right? It has committed acts that the UN says are genocidal, right? Why might people want to reject this argument? Well, it's a powerful term, right? You can't, accusing someone of genocide is going to create an emotional reaction, right? And so people may have an emotional reaction because of the way they see their country. They may have an emotional reaction because of the way they see themselves, right? It could have to do with privilege. It's very easy to ignore the experiences of the minoritized group when you're in the dominant group, right? Because that's not your reality, right? That's not your experience. You don't have to deal with those things usually on a day-to-day basis. And so non-Indigenous Canada can pretty much go on with their lives without too much disruption. But these things continue to impact Indigenous communities across Canada, right? Again, what are the consequences of believing it or not believing it? Well, if you believe it, then you can actually solve the issue, right? You can't fix something if you don't acknowledge that there's an issue in the first place, right? And so not acknowledging what's happened here in the past means that nothing changes, right? Indigenous people continue to suffer in their communities, racism and discrimination continues, and we have the same thing as we've had for decades before, right? So again, one of the things I tried to point out to you when we first talked about critical thinking is that your beliefs are important, right? The beliefs that you have influence your life, right? And it's the same thing is true for a country, right? If a country doesn't believe something, it actually has a big effect on what happens within that country. And so if we don't believe that this is what's happened, then again, nothing changes. We continue to be a country that is guilty of racism and discrimination towards its Indigenous people. I'm just going to skip over here. Okay, so I said a little bit earlier on that the effects of this relationship continue to kind of reverberate through Indigenous communities. You cannot do this to a culture of people and expect everyone to be fine, right? You can't destroy their way of life, push them onto reserves, take their children from them, brutalize them, discriminate against them on a racial basis in society. You can't do all those things and expect that there's going to be no negative consequences. And so indeed, there are consequences, and you can see them showing up, again, when you look at some of the broad societal numbers, right? So here, I know this is a bit of an old statistic, unemployment rate, the rate of employment for Indigenous peoples is 62%. So that's the percent of the population that is employed, not unemployed. But that's a pretty big difference from non-Indigenous Canada at almost 76%, right? There's a lot more Indigenous people are unemployed. Look at the median after-tax income. For non-Indigenous people, $27,600, which is really low. Just over $20,000 for Indigenous people. So Indigenous people make significantly less money than do non-Indigenous Canadians. Have a look at this. 30% of the Indigenous population did not have a high school diploma or equivalent, right? That's bad news, right? Because what can you really do without a high school diploma? Not much, right? Pretty low-level service jobs. Can't go on to college, can't go on to university. You're kind of stuck in a certain type of job that doesn't pay very well at all. And a full 30% of their community doesn't have a high school diploma. That's a huge problem. The 12.1% for non-Indigenous Canadians, That's a big problem in itself. Never mind 30%, which is significantly larger, right? I know that's an old stat. These are 2010, 2011. I don't know that these numbers have improved appreciably since then, but I'd have to kind of double check. Have a look at some health numbers here. So the UN uses Human Development Index, the HDI, as kind of a rough measure of how are people living in a country? What's their life like? And so they look at their life expectancy as kind of a measure of health. They look at their literacy rate as a measure of education. It's a pretty rough measure. And their per capita income based on, for their financial health. They do a bunch of math and they come up with a number. The USA is 7th in the world, believe it or not. Canada is the 8th. But look at the First Nations people living within the US and within Canada. They're 31st and 33rd. So those people, in a way, are living in a totally different country within this one, right? Their life expectancies, their literacy rates, their per capita incomes are significantly different, even though they're living in the same country as the rest of us, right? Again, that's a bit of an alarm bell, right? There is one racial group that is disadvantaged, right? Significantly within both of these countries. In Canada, the poverty rate is 11%, give or take, which again is not great, right? That's 1 in 10 people in Canada are living in poverty. It's a big, big number. However, that number is 22% for people of color, right? Versus 9% for white people. So again, there's a racial discrepancy here, right? People are far more likely to live in poverty if they're a person of color. If you look at criminal justice here, the people that are going to prison, usually we measure that by incarceration rate. So how much of a country's population is in prison, right? For Canada, on average, is 54 per 100,000. Okay, so that's our incarceration rate. On average, 54 people of every 100,000 are currently in prison. But look at this. Indigenous men are far more overrepresented in the prison system. They're only 3% of the population in Canada, but in prison, they're 26% of the population. Big difference, right? And those are big numbers too. If 54 people per 100,000, we have 36 million people. I'm not going to do the math in my head because I know I will make a mistake, but that's a lot of people who are in prison. And again, Indigenous men and Indigenous women and Indigenous youth in particular are far overrepresented in the criminal justice system, right? In theory, all things being equal, if you've got 3% of Indigenous men in society, you should have 3% Indigenous men in prison, all things being equal. But things are not equal, right? And the numbers show you that. And it's not a matter of a couple of percent either way. It's a full 20% more. That's huge. I've got lots and lots of text here, but if you look at life expectancy, so for Canadian women, 83 years and 79 years for men. Sorry guys, but we just don't live as long as women do in pretty much every country around the world. But look at the difference between Indigenous women and Indigenous men. There's a full, 7 to 8 years difference between the two. That's a big difference, right? These people are living in the same country as the rest of us, and yet they're living almost a decade shorter. It's a long time, right? Inuit are First Nations people living in kind of the far north of Canada. Indigenous First Nations youth are 5 to 6 times more likely to commit suicide. Inuit youth 10 times. Big numbers, right? So Indigenous people are overrepresented in terms of being in poverty, being in prison, likelihood of mental illness or suicide, and they are underrepresented in terms of how should I put this? I guess they're underrepresented in social institutions themselves. So there are not a lot of Indigenous lawyers. There's not a lot of Indigenous doctors. There's not a lot of Indigenous heads of companies. There's not a lot of Indigenous people who are serving in government, who have been elected to government. And so, again, Indigenous people are just like women when we talked about women's suffrage. They want to make changes, but they're not in control of any social institutions. And so they can't make those changes for themselves. They need the dominant group, they need the people who are in control of social institutions to do that. But that can be difficult, right? Because you have to overcome prejudice and stereotype and discrimination and people not wanting to give up power and people not believing that there's a problem, right? There's a quote in that article where our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, said that we have no history of colonialism in Canada. Ridiculous, right? Ridiculous statement. But we still have the people at the top of government refusing to acknowledge what's happened here. Or if they do acknowledge it, like Prime Minister Trudeau, they don't do anything about it. Even though when he was elected in 2014, 2016, I forget the year, even when he was elected, he made big promises about how he was going to engage with the Indigenous community and make a bunch of changes and blah, 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 blah. None of those things have really happened. Yeah, and it would be easy to think, it would be easy to look at the struggles that some Indigenous communities have, and it would be very easy to blame it on them, right? It must be something wrong with them, their culture, their community. They have bad values, or they're just bad people. It would be very easy to believe that, but again, if you look at the history, you'll see that's not the case, right? There's nothing wrong with people. It's they respond to the treatment that you give them. And when you treat people this way, yeah, they tend to suffer, right? They have a lot of trauma. They have a lot of emotional injury. And those things don't heal very quickly or very easily. And they certainly don't heal quickly or easily when your country wants to pretend it never happened, right? So again, we have a lot of evidence that Indigenous communities are still struggling, and they are struggling because of that history, right? Not because of anything, not because of some personal characteristic that is wrong with them. Okay, so reconciliation. Again, there's lots of bad news in this story, but there are some flickers of hope here as well. And I've got some slides here with a lot of information on them. It's probably too much for us to really know, but I'll share it with you anyway. An important milestone in this discussion of Indigenous people was Truth and Reconciliation. And so this was a commission set up by the federal government. They traveled all the way across Canada, and what they did was they heard the stories of residential school survivors. And so people who had gone to residential school were invited to come out. You okay there, girls? Do you have a question? Or no? People who were survivors of residential schools were allowed to come out. They were allowed to tell their stories. The commission would listen to them, keep records of everything. They listened to stories. It took them, I think it took them over a year to sort of travel across Canada to all sorts of different cities, hear everybody's stories, record them, talk with people, and finally they issued a massive report at the end. And so, here you can see it's 5 years, I guess. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission releases its final report, and in the end of it, it had 94 recommendations, right? 94 calls to action. So the idea was the commission documented what had happened and said, okay, if you want to fix this, here are 94 things that you need to do, Canada. This is how you need to fix it. And so again, this was an important milestone, and it was probably one that made much more of Canada aware of what happened with Indian residential schools and just with Indigenous people in general, right? This was, people sharing their stories is what allowed a larger collection of people to know what happened. And so it was a big deal, right? And again, it was a 5-year report, right? The research and writing of that took 5 years. Again, there's lots of little court cases, which I don't think I'll speak to here. There's been some court settlements, as you can see. There's also been a national inquiry into missing and murdered, Indigenous women. Indigenous women are far more likely to go missing and to be murdered than any other demographic in Canada, okay? And Indigenous communities have been calling for an inquiry into this. Our former Prime Minister Stephen Harper said, actually, that's not really on our radar. We know people are being murdered. That's why we have an RCMP. They'll solve it, right? But here under Justin Trudeau, we finally had a national inquiry happen. Again, lots of research, lots of interviews. A report was created. I don't think much has happened as a result. And so tomorrow what I'd like to show you is a short documentary called Eighth Fire. And it has to do with Indigenous people right now in Canada, because one of the things that it's easy to be guilty of with Indigenous people is to look at them in the past tense, right? So we know that they were here for thousands of years. We know that they were hunting and gathering and sort of living off the land and living their sort of traditional lifestyle. And it's easy to kind of leave them in the past. But the fact is that they're not in the past. They're not a museum exhibit. They are living, breathing cultures that still exist here in Canada. And so it's important to kind of not only know the history and know the past, but also to know the present, right? And understand why, what Indigenous people are kind of doing right now, right? How are they trying to reclaim and express their culture? What kind of things are they doing? What kind of struggles are they still encountering, right? And so that'll be tomorrow, to kind of look into the window of Indigenous people in Canada right now and kind of see what's happening, right? See what's happening in some people's lives anyway. Okay, so there's that. The other thing I'll mention very quickly is that I had a request on Friday to extend the paper deadline to Friday from Wednesday. And so I agreed with that extension. So I'll change it in Microsoft Teams. If you still want to hand it in on Wednesday, you absolutely may. But yeah, I'll extend it to Friday at their request.
Friday midnight.
Friday midnight. Yeah. Other than that, I think I will probably end it here, and tomorrow we'll get into that eighth fire thing. Okay? So that's it. Have a good afternoon. I will see you tomorrow.